Oh. Good morning and welcome to Whenever You Are. I am Bandit Haze, and today I'm going to be talking about 80s video games. Now, first of all, shout out to Nova for the suggestion. If you have a suggestion of anything you want me to explain, whether that's movie related, video game related, or indeed anything related, remember, Haze knows everything. Asterisk. Alright, so let me set the scene a little bit. The 80s was a time when we were able to travel at the speed of sound. We didn't have to leave the house to get milk, and twerk just meant that you were trying to earn a living. Actually, to be fair, that one's still pretty much the same. Now, as for video games, the first electronic game that I can remember getting was a handheld machine. It had a monochrome LCD screen. It had one game built into it. I don't remember the name of the game, probably some fighting game though. But I had one, my brother had one, and what people would do is that once you got done playing your game, you swap it around with your friend, so eventually everybody gets to play everything.
So in the 80s, I had a Commodore 64, which at the time I thought was the dog's bollocks, but it was actually just bollocks. And one of my favourite games I had for it, it was tapes. And I had one game called Gandalf the Sorcerer, which you were like Gandalf in this castle, and you had to like shoot out these magic darts or whatever to kill these little monsters who were trying to come in and nick the princess. And once they got the gate up a certain amount, they'd put a little spider in. And back then it was well cool with the doodly 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 music. But look back at it now, still cool for nostalgia reasons, but it's actually pretty shit. And another shit thing about the Commodore 64 from the 80s was the loading screen. It'd take so long, and it'd be like, and then you'd be waiting for fucking ages with lines going to get your picture of the actual game. But the 80s is still cool.
So at around the same time, Nintendo had Game & Watch, which was pretty much the same sort of thing as the other LCD handhelds at the time. But being Nintendo, it was far more popular than the no-name bastard child games that we had. So a few years later, when we got our first Game & Watch, it was a pretty big deal. I got a game called Squish, my brother got Donkey Kong. Squish was a pretty good game, but Donkey Kong was so much better. Like, not even, it was just a far superior game. I mean, the Squish was good, I'm not knocking Squish, but Donkey Kong was the boom. So what I do is I take that off my brother and just play that instead. I played that quite a lot. In fact, I actually got pretty good at the game. Like, I don't remember what my highest score was, but I do remember that it got faster and faster and faster the further and further you got. And I got to a point where everything's moving like the DeLorean at top speed, and I'm just there in Zen mode, like when Neo realizes he's the chosen one, just like
I still remember to this very day, that day that I got a Nintendo Entertainment System many years ago, back when I was a kid. Before this, I've played arcade games, LCD games, had fun with pinball machines. If memory serves me right, I played games on my uncle's Sega Master System. And I still remember having fun with the Fun to Drive Corvette dashboard video game and playing with action figures. But I digress. Back to Nintendo. I still remember those old NES commercials on TV that ended on the note, "Now you're playing with power." So one evening I was watching TV with my mom. Suddenly she stood up as she saw my dad arrive. She then said to me, "Now you're playing with power." I didn't realize what she meant until I saw my dad walking in with a Nintendo Entertainment System. And the same evening, we ended up playing Super Mario Bros. As I played Mario on his quest to save Princess Toadstool from King Koopa, aka Bowser, and the Koopa Army. I was playing a hero, going up against enemies including Little Goombas, Koopa Troopas, Koopa Paratroopas, Cheep Cheeps, Piranha Plants, to name some of them. From that moment onwards, I was playing with power, since the power button was on. It wasn't as much fun when it was turned off.
Now, because we had these handhelds, we could only play the one built-in game that came with it for so long. By the time the Game Boy came out, it blew minds because the games were interchangeable. Changeable. Here's the thing though, the Game Boy came out in 1989 in Japan and in the United States, and then in 1990 in the UK, but we didn't get one till maybe 91 or 92 or so, so it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about it like an 80s console since I wasn't actually playing it in the 80s, but whatever. It came with Tetris, and that game had everybody hooked. I think the most I ever got in Tetris was something like 120 plus lines, and just like Donkey Kong, by that point everything is moving faster than Flojo in the 1988 Olympics.
Yo, what up everybody, it's PrinceThaGamer at y'all with a video. This is pertaining to Bandit Haze. Shout out to Bandit Haze on his experiment about what is our favorite video game of the top favorite video games of the 80s. And I'm gonna tell y'all my top video game right now of the 80s. And I was actually born in the early 90s, but my top video game that I actually got to play from the 80s was Frogger. Frogger was definitely my top favorite game in the 80s because it taught me, that game taught me discipline. That was our Dark Souls at that time, you know what I'm saying? And it just taught my mind to be sharp, you know, dodging the cars. That game was, it was difficult, but it was fun at the same time, and that's why I enjoyed the game. But Frogger is the one I chose. Peace.
Let me get onto the proper games now. So the first home games console that we had was technically a PC, though not like how we think of PCs today. It was a Sinclair, I don't remember the model, but this thing was terrible. Like, it was so bad. Here's the thing, you know how when you turn on your computer and it takes more than 10 seconds to boot up, you'd be sitting there like, oh my god, this is taking ages. This machine took longer to get ready than the build-up to a Dragon Ball Z fight. And when it finally was ready, you couldn't just play a game. Let me tell you something. You youngsters today just don't know the struggle. You put in the disc, enter some codes, enter some more codes, take out the disc, enter some more codes, enter some more codes, put back in the disc, enter some more codes, you do the hokey cokey and you turn around, enter some more codes. I mean, you'd be sitting there practically typing out a Stephen King novel just so you can get the game to run. And when you finally got the game to run, the games that we had, they're alright. I've forgotten most of them by now, but the one that I do remember was actually a pretty good game, and that was Trantor, the Last Stormtrooper.
Hey everybody, it's LifeSpiller, and I'm here to do a response from a good buddy named BH. He reached out to me, he asked me what video game stood out to me in the 80s, and I just have to say that my biggest game of all time from the 80s is Mega Man 2. Reason why, it's easily one of my favorite NES games. One of the hardest games that I probably beat as a kid. I was only 12 when I had this game, and I think that was around 92, 91, 92 or something like that. I'm now 38, and this game still stands out to me. Has an awesome soundtrack. I love the fact that you could take powers from each character and use those powers in opposite ways as a counter reaction to kill other bosses. But then on top of that, it just added on levels upon levels of difficulty to push you to see where you can go. But this game is still one of my favorite NES games. I even have like my little Sprite. I have my little Mega Man mug. I got this a while back. I've had tons of Mega Man things that I've kept, but this still is like one of my favorite nostalgic games to play. So I would definitely advise you to check it out. I love it. I love it. I love it. But other than that, I'm LifeSpiller. I'm out.
Trantor the Last Stormtrooper was a quality game. I definitely spent a lot of time with it, but I don't remember getting very far because it was a pretty tough game, which, to be fair, games back then generally were quite tough for a lot of reasons. One is because they were made to be tough games, and two, because most games didn't have save points. Some of the bigger games would give you a code when you got to a certain point in the game, so the next time you play you could just enter that code and skip ahead to that part. But if you lost the code, you couldn't just look it up on the internet, you know, unless your friend had it or something like that, then you were screwed. You just had to start all over again. And speaking of codes, cheat codes were like the stuff of legends, tales of old, passed down from generation to generation. People would gather around the campfire to hear the wise old griot speak of this magical code. Yeah, it wasn't that deep, but you know, not too far off because you couldn't get cheat codes that easily. Some magazines did print a few, but not everybody bought magazines things, especially if you were saving to buy a game, you don't really want to be spending any part of that on anything else. So a lot of the time it was you heard it from a friend who heard it from their cousin, who heard it from their brother, who heard it from their uncle, who heard it from his friend who works at some games company, and probably not the same games company that made a game that you're trying to get a cheat code for. But you know what? As inefficient as it was back then, we still always managed to get a hold of cheat codes. I mean, you know, not that I used any, of course. Just saying.
Hey guys, DugeonJay here. I'm dropping down a little bit of a video about nostalgic 80s games. I was born in 1978, and because of that, I got to see Galaga, I got to see Pac-Man, I got to see Donkey Kong, I got to see a bunch of these games fresh, pole position. And when I think about 80s games in general, one of the ones that actually stands out in my mind is a game that was produced back in 1984. It was by Data East, and it was one of the first 1v1 player games that you could find in the arcade with, you know, a joystick. And interestingly enough, I found it in a clothing store, and there was a waiting room with an arcade in there, and in that arcade was the Karate Champ. And it was the first time I got to play against other kids 1v1 in that kind of style of setting. And this is all before Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2, so it was very engaging, it was very new, and I honestly believe that some of the Street Fighter was actually taken from the Karate Champ. So when I think about 80s games that really inspired me and really set the way for fighting games in general, I have to give a head nod towards the Karate Champ. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and spin this back to Bandit Haze. I hope you guys enjoy this. Have a great day gaming.
So because the Sinclair machine was such a pain, we eventually got an Amstrad. Again, I don't remember the model, but this thing was state of the art. It didn't take forever to load up. You can get into games a whole lot easier, and it came with a modulator, so if you plugged an aerial into it, you can watch television broadcasts. It didn't have a remote, so you literally had to get up and turn the knob to tune into different channels. But when you're a kid, having a television in your room where you can watch whatever you want to watch and your parents do not know what you are watching, I won't get into that. Maybe that's another video. Let me just stick to the games for now. So yeah, the Amstrad was a far better machine than the Sinclair, but out of all the games that we had, none of them were as good as Trantor. One of them was a track and field game. In fact, I think it actually was called Track and Field, but this game was a piss take. And speaking of piss, let me come back to that. But this track and field game was ridiculous. It was one of these games where you had to wiggle the joystick as fast as possible to move your character. But no matter how fast you wiggled it, your character would never move any faster than a handicapped snail. Meanwhile, the computer characters were like, zoom! What is the bloody point? I think the game that I played the most in the Amstrad though was a puzzle game called Solomon's Key, where you had to break certain blocks to move around. And if I remember correctly, and to be fair, kind of a big if at this point, but if I remember correctly, that was the first game that I actually got all the way to the end on, which would have been a pretty big deal, but all that happens is that the game just loops right back to the beginning. There's no end credits, there's no congratulations, no thanks for playing, nope, just starts all over again without any acknowledgement. Now the Amstrad eventually broke. I don't know how it broke, but here's what I remember. I remember having a dream, or at least I think it was a dream, but I got up in the middle of the night and pissed on the computer. Now in my mind, it seems more like a memory than a dream. Like I feel like I can remember it actually happening, but the next day, there was no piss on the Amstrad, no piss on the floor, no smell, no stickiness, nothing. Just a games machine that all of a sudden did not work. Until this day, I have no idea if I really did get up in the middle of the night for some odd reason and decide to piss on the Amstrad, and then somehow all evidence of that just disappeared, or if something else just caused it to break. I mean, logically, I guess something else would have happened, but I don't know, it just feels like that really did. In my mind, it feels like I really did do that. I have no idea. It's honestly one of the biggest mysteries of my life.
If I had to pick my favorite game from the 1980s, it would have to be the original Castlevania, even though Symphony of the Night's my favorite. But the original Castlevania was just so unique. Not only did it have the dark fantasy horror element of including all of the original Universal monsters, plus all kinds of other things from myth and legend from around the world, but it also had that great Japanese twist that games always have, such as, you know, having a magic vampire killer whip as opposed to swords or any type of conventional weapons. And it was just such a great mix of mood, atmosphere, level building, the fantastic music of the game, and actually have thrown in that little bit of plot line, you know, to being more than just a Pac-Man running around eating balls in a thing, or just being a Mario guy jumping on mushrooms and trying to save the same princess only to end up at the wrong castle every time. So I would have to pick the original Castlevania for my favorite game and memories from the 1980s.
So anyway, Nintendo and Sega of course were doing their thing big in the 80s, but we never had an NES, and I didn't get a Master System until around 91 or so. It was the Master System 2, and it was actually the first console I ever bought with my own money. I had to save up for weeks, months even, went without school dinners and everything, but totally worth it. It came with Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and I mastered that game, had the whole paper, scissors, stone routine on lock. And that is what I think of 80s video games. What do you think? Radical, man, or bogus? Let me know down below, and big thank you to everyone who sent in a video: Jid Lid, PrinceThaGamer, LifeSpiller, BelgianDan, DugeonJay, and MindlessBile. That might not be the same order in which they appeared in the video. I might change it around a little bit, but we'll see. Anyway, there will be links to all their channels in the description, so please make sure you check them all out. And if you like this video, give it a like and share it amongst your friends. If you did not like it, then give it a dislike and share it amongst your enemies. Either way, let me know your reasons in the comments. Subscribe if you have not already. Thank you for watching, and until whenever, if ever, now you're playing with power.